Let's see if I can. You want me?
That's fine. All right, so tonight's
Sorry.
presentation.
Okay.
There we go. Okay. So tonight's presentation, I just realized actually that I said I was going to do a lot of different things, probably too many different things. But I do want to focus on archaeology. I want to make sure we take time to do that. I also want to make sure that we talk about Jesus and his observance and who he was religiously. And I'm going to start out by just mentioning Judaism and Christianity, the relationship, and really briefly. And so, as we know, the first Christians were Jews, and that included Jesus. And this is really the direct link, if you will, between Jesus and Judaism. The earliest Christian deviation, if you will, from Judaism comes from our earliest Christian writer, St. Paul, who believed, in his letters, talked about things like the resurrection of Jesus and things like that. Paul, as we know, or as we suspect, was the earliest Christian writer. He wrote shortly after Jesus walked the earth, within 10 or 15 years. And we have letters from Paul. Paul was also a Jew. He came from a Jewish background. He says in his letters, I am a Pharisee. I studied under rabbis and stuff like that. And the only thing we really have from Paul, we don't have a biography of Jesus, but from the earliest Christian writer, we learn that things like the resurrection were probably some of the earliest stories about Jesus, himself a Jew, that were circulating among the followers of Jesus, who probably believed that he was the Messiah. But if you look at the letters of Paul, there's no stories of virgin births, baby stories, pigs running off a cliff into the ocean. There's nothing like that. Paul did not write biography, the Gospels, if you will. That stuff came later. So the earliest Christians likely believed that Jesus was the long-awaited resurrected Messiah, the Jewish Messiah. And I have a slide coming up on that later. Damien, next slide, if you will. I promised last presentation when I did part one of this in the fall on the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures and archaeology. I was convinced I didn't show enough pictures. So I want to be sure I show pictures in this presentation. As far as archaeology goes, we're going to talk about it a little bit later on in this presentation. It's sort of interspersed with the other things I have to say. Quite honestly, archaeology from the early Christian era, archaeology going back to Jesus' time, is also not an exact science. We're not positive that we can name the exact places Jesus walked, for example. We know the cities, they're named in the Gospels. Paul doesn't really talk about them, but the later Gospel authors, writing about 50 years after Jesus, they definitely talk about Jesus was at Bethsaida. Jesus was at Caesarea Philippi. Jesus went back home to Capernaum. It seems to have been Jesus' home base. And of course, Jesus went to Jerusalem. But we're not always positive exactly where some of this stuff was, exactly where Jesus would have been in that city. Interestingly, this is a picture I wanted to show, just a fun archaeology picture. This is from a place called Caesarea Philippi. It's mentioned a couple times in the Gospels as a place nearby where Jesus did miracles. And Jesus, for example, Jesus in Matthew's Gospel, Matthew 16, gives Peter the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And things like that. He's going to be the rock upon which the church is built. We think this took place near Caesarea Philippi, not necessarily in it. Also the transfiguration of Jesus. But what is interesting when you archaeologically look at Caesarea Philippi, and this is part of the difficulty of excavating even New Testament sites, is there's other stuff there that has already been there. And I know new stuff is on top of old stuff, but a lot of the old stuff at some cities like Caesarea Philippi is still there. For example, in Caesarea Philippi, this is called the Grotto of Pan. We know about 3 centuries before Jesus walked the earth that the Greeks set up a temple here, especially a temple like a dedication site to the god Pan, the god of music, god of sheep herders, stuff like that. This ancient Greco god Pan, who's usually portrayed playing a flute or something like that. And some people said, it is said in ancient times that this cave area in the Grotto of Pan, where human sacrifices literally took place about 2 or 3 centuries before Jesus was around. Some people actually consider this entrance to these caves like the actual gate to hell. So it's just an interesting archaeological picture here from a little bit before Christian times, but also during Christian times. Jesus would have literally seen this stuff if he ever actually went into Caesarea Philippi, where it sort of doesn't say. It sort of says he's always nearby. Next slide, please, Damien. So one of the things that the synopsis for this lecture talked about was, what was Jesus about? What kind of Judaism did Jesus practice? And I have a couple slides more later on this. There's no doubt Jesus was a Jew. I mean, even the Gospels, the Christian scriptures, the New Testament even confirms, where we have Jesus saying a couple of times, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So Jesus himself says, I'm a Jew. And I have more information about that coming up. But a lot of people tend to think that historically and archaeologically, like, Jesus was a Christian. Jesus went to church. Let me make clear, there were no churches at the time of Jesus, okay? Jesus would have only known synagogues. And actually coming up, I have a picture of an archaeological excavation of a synagogue that actually dates probably from the time Jesus walked the earth. So Jesus would have only known going to the synagogue. So one thing archaeologists and historians, one thing have to do is, as I probably said last fall several times, we can't read the 21st century back into the ancient world. It simply doesn't work. We have to think about things as they were in Jesus' time, when there were no churches, there were no priests, there was none of that. In fact, if you look at the word in the Gospels, the word church or Christianity, it shows up like one time. There's one mention that's sort of vague, and it doesn't mean a church. It's just kind of the same word that would later be used. But Jesus was Jewish, and I'm going to talk about a little later the Judaism of Jesus' time. It's not the same as it is today. Again, we can't read modern Jewish practice into Jewish practice of 2,000 years ago. I have an example or two of that later. So even the Gospels say, Luke chapter 4, verse 16, even has Jesus, it's recorded about Jesus, he went to the synagogue as his custom was on the Sabbath day. Jesus was a good Jewish follower who went to synagogue. And we also, and this is something I'm not going to touch upon so much in this lecture, but just want you to be aware of, since the first Christians were Jews, they were still observing Jewish holidays and the like. They just believed that the Messiah had come, whereas other Jews did not. Even a few 200-300 years later, in some parts of the ancient Near Eastern world, we know that there were still Christians, even when Christianity was beginning to break away finally and separate more entirely from Judaism. Even then, we have writers like Origen, who lived a couple hundred years after Jesus. And in his homilies on Leviticus, Origen, this great church father from Egypt way, even says, for if you bring that which you learned from the Jew yesterday into the church today. So Origen seems to be indicating that 200 years later, that there were some Christians coming to church on Sunday talking about what they learned yesterday in the synagogue. So one thing, as historians and archaeologists, we can't just pretend that Christianity dropped out of the sky and it was a totally separate religion. Of course it is today, but we can't pretend that that was the case 2,000 years ago. Even a couple hundred years after Jesus, apparently in at least some places, there were still Christians following Jewish stuff. Next slide, please. This is that ancient synagogue that I was talking about. This is a place called Gamala. It's up in northern Israel, Galilee way. It was eventually invaded. It was a Jewish city that was eventually invaded by the Romans around 67. They destroyed a lot of the city, but archaeologists in the 20th, 21st century have excavated Gamala. And one of the things they dug up, and this is a small portion of the synagogues, actually, this long rectangle, this is just like one corner of it. This is actually the ancient synagogue that they found at Gamala that likely dates from the time that Jesus actually walked the earth, if not a few years afterwards. In the ancient world, synagogues were out there for Jews, but they weren't nearly as prevalent as they were today. Even the word synagogue, by the way, it's a Greek word. It's not a Hebrew word or anything like that. It was like a gathering place, a community gathering place. Synagogues, as we know them in Judaism, there are some from this time period, but not many. But this is just a great picture that gives you more of a visualization. It helps archaeologists visualize what a synagogue might have looked like in Jesus' time. So this is just a really cool picture of an ancient synagogue that was excavated. Next slide, please. Okay, eventually, as time passed, and yes, I am going to talk about Jesus' observance of Judaism a little bit more, but I just want to clarify a couple of things in the modern tense, in the modern sense of things, in the contemporary world. Today, Jesus has no function in Judaism whatsoever. That is often a really misunderstood concept. I teach world religions. I've taught world religions at WVU for many, many years. I invented the course, actually. I created the class probably 15, 20 years ago. And one of the questions people, when I ask, what is Jesus' role in Judaism? A lot of times students will say he's a prophet, he's a great teacher. Jews don't believe he's the son of God, but he's still, a very revered figure in Judaism. That is really not true. In Judaism, technically speaking, he's not considered a prophet, not considered a holy man, not even a great Jewish teacher, the Messiah, Son of God, Son of Man. None of those titles apply to Jesus in Judaism today. So he's definitely not the Son of God. Jews do not have any concept of Trinity. So as Christianity developed, yes, it broke away from Judaism, developed unique concepts like Jesus is the Son of God, the Trinity, original sin, things like that. These concepts don't exist in Judaism. Now, in Jesus' own time, as I said, Jesus practiced Judaism. However, as I tell my students, Jesus was not an international superstar in his own lifetime. Again, we're projecting the modern understanding of Judaism, of Jesus, back into the ancient world. It's not the case. The vast majority of Jews in Jesus' own time rejected him and rejected his perceived claims of messiahship. In other words, the Jews that started Christianity and believed he was the Messiah were the vast, vast minority group. Most Jews did not accept Jesus as the Messiah. Simply put, he did not fulfill what Jews expected from the traditional Jewish Messiah. Number one on that list being the Messiah would vanquish the enemies of the Jews. And as you probably know, during the Jesus lifetime, Rome, the Roman Empire, which had conquered ancient Israel, ancient Palestine, many, many decades earlier, ancient Israel, where Jesus grew up, Nazareth, Galilee, Jerusalem, was under Roman rule. And Jesus did not end that Roman rule. He simply did not do what Jews expected. He did not fulfill Jewish expectations of the Messiah. So that's where the initial deviation from Judaism probably came from. There were Jews that believed he was the Messiah. They went on to become Christians. And there were Jews who did not believe he's the Messiah. Those were the forerunners of the modern Jews today. Next slide, please. I'm just going to skip this slide. It's not that probably. Let's go to the next slide, please. I want to be sure we get through it. So the passage that we read a few minutes ago from Origen, this idea, hey, don't bring to church on Sunday what you learned from the Jews on Saturday. That last passage indicates that Judaism and Christianity remained linked for some time. And this definitely impacted views of Jesus. Early Christians, as time passed, again, our earliest Christian writer, who was Jewish himself by derivation, Paul, in his letters, he does not have stories of virgin births, no exorcism stories, no baby miracle stories, no shepherds, none of that stuff. Paul doesn't have that. Why not? He's the first Christian writer. He should have known that stuff. Honestly, Paul didn't know or Paul didn't care. Those are about the only two reasons I can think of why they were not included in Paul's letters, which were more instruction than biography. The Gospels are essentially biographies of Jesus. Paul's letters were more instructional letters. Hey, Romans, this is what you should be doing. Hey, people in Corinth, was a rugged seaport city in Greece. Hey, you need to straighten up your act and get your morality in order. So his letters were mostly instructional, I realize. But still, in the course of his many, many discussions about Jesus, sin, things like that, he never has any of these stories, which possibly suggests to historians and biblical scholars and even archaeologists that these stories about Jesus were not known yet or weren't circulated yet, or quite simply, and I know this is somewhat controversial, had not developed yet. Paul doesn't really talk about Jesus much as the Son of God. He doesn't. And even the phrase Son of God, which I'm not going to get into in this lecture, is a very debated phrase. It doesn't necessarily mean a divinity. In fact, there are Jewish prayers that date back roughly to the time of Jesus that use the phrase Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King. So Jews had long considered the idea of God being Father. It wasn't anything that was invented. And even phrase Son of God, King David and Solomon, they were called sons of God. God's like, I will be a father to them. They will be a son to me. He talked about kings of Israel that way. Next slide, please. This is one of the more fascinating symbols that I've come across in my tours of archaeological sites and the 9 or so years I dug at Bethsaida in Israel for parts of 9 seasons. It's in northern Israel out towards Galilee by the Golan Heights. This actually comes from Laodicea, Turkey. This is again, this is, if you have to envision this, this is from the archaeological site at Laodicea in Turkey. And this is actually a huge pillar that's lying on the ground there. So the picture you see is like a telephoto lens of me really focusing my telephoto lens on one little tiny portion of that pillar. It's a pillar that's 1,500 years old or so. We know it's ancient. It might have actually been from a synagogue. There was a large Jewish population in Turkey for centuries and centuries and centuries. But what is really interesting about this, and what illustrates, archaeologically speaking, how Judaism and Christianity sort of remained linked for a long time. Remember, this is about 500 years after Jesus walked the earth. We see here a cross. But if you see the cross, if you see like the bulb at the bottom of the cross, it's superimposed upon a Jewish menorah. And if you look to each side of that stemmed menorah, that candelabra, on the left-hand side, you see a palm branch, and on the right-hand side, you see like a little backwards L. That is probably a shofar, a ram's horn, which was traditionally used and still is used in Judaism, and palm branches were always symbols of Judaism. So what is fascinating about this archaeological discovery is that you see both religions having their symbols side by side or on top of each other. So whoever put this cross, and this cross was probably done last. We don't know who did it. Archaeologists, as I say, oftentimes archaeologists can tell you what something is. We can't often tell you why it's there. So this is sheer speculation. But what is interesting about this cross, which looks to be the last thing added here, it's deep, it's superimposed on the menorah, is that whoever carved this cross, presumably obviously a Christian, did not destroy the Jewish symbols, did not cross out the palm branch, which is typically in the ancient world what you did. If you wanted to show that something was better or more important than something else, you scratched off. Think of the pharaohs in Egypt. When one pharaoh died, the other pharaoh would scratch off all the stuff pertaining to him and sometimes destroy all his statues because I'm the new pharaoh, I'm the important guy, not that old guy. Same thing here, but what is interesting is that the Jewish symbols were actually
Hello, all. I feel like we may have lost Dr. Gale. Savannah, has he frozen up for you as well?
Yep, he's frozen for me.
Okay. I asked for some patience, all. Let's see what's going on here. Oh, yeah, we look like we lost him here. So just hang on a bit. I think that looks like an internet connection issue. Let's see if he'll be back. Let's see if he comes back. Give him a few minutes. Thanks for your patience and apologies for the issues this evening. He just emailed me and told me that his computer crashed. So I believe he's going to. I asked him if he's going to try to. He's going to try to restart it, and let's see what happens. So once again, as I say, I apologize for the inconvenience, and I thank you for your patience. Let's see if we can get Dr. Gill back on here to continue what seems to be a very interesting lecture. So give me a few minutes. I will keep you all updated as into what's going on. Thank you. Okay, Dr. Gale is working on getting the laptop back up. So just continue to give us a few more minutes, and thanks for your patience. And hopefully we're gonna see him pop back on here pretty soon. So thanks again. Dr.
Can
Gale,
anybody hear me?
I can hear you. You're back.
Okay, I'm on a laptop. It still says you can't start video because the host hasn't accepted it. But I think I'm back on a laptop. So
Yep.
I don't know if my camera works or not, but doesn't really matter as long as we can
Well,
see the PowerPoint.
we're not seeing
Uh,
you, but we can hear you, and the PowerPoint is here. So let's keep
okay,
going.
that's fine. Okay, so this was what was really interesting about this piece, this archaeological pillar that we found, is that you see a Christian symbol on top of a Jewish symbol, possibly illustrating for us the idea that Judaism and Christianity were still linked. Next slide, please. So let's look at what we know about archaeology and Jesus. We know that Jesus existed. Of this, there is little doubt. It's not like archaeologists or scholars don't like know if Jesus existed. There was a guy named Jewish. It's more a guy named Jesus who was around Galilee. I don't really think I have any problem as a historian or archaeologist saying that. But as I noted earlier, it didn't mean he went to church on Sunday. According to the Gospels, which may or may not be perfectly accurate, the Gospels at times, there are four of them in the Bible, four biographies of Jesus: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They don't always agree with each other. They don't necessarily say the same things about Jesus. So that's a whole different lecture. But nonetheless, we know that Jesus existed. The precise details about the life of Jesus are what's harder to prove. In other words, that everything in the Gospels, everything that is recorded, the exorcisms, the healing of the blind, feeding the multitudes, many of the miracles of Jesus, can we prove archaeologically that they took place? The answer would mostly be no, we can't prove it. Doesn't mean they didn't happen. It just means we don't have the evidence to say that they did. And yes, as the last bullet indicates, it's somewhat rougher because even the Gospels disagree at some points. Like, was the Last Supper on Passover? Mark, Matthew, and Luke say, yes, it was. John clearly says, no, it was not a Passover meal. So we know Jesus existed. That's not archaeologically anything that we're worried about. But as far as trying to say, where did Jesus walk? That's a little bit tougher. Next slide, please. For example, a lot of places, a lot of archaeological sites in Israel in particular that are related to Jesus are more points of speculation than they are a place that we can prove Jesus was there. This is looking over this rocky like cliff onto that flat plain. This is called the Mount of Precipice near Nazareth, where according to Luke chapter 4, Jesus goes to synagogue in Nazareth. He gets into trouble with the people in the synagogue, the other Jews in the synagogue. They don't like what he's teaching. They don't like what he's saying. And eventually they chase him from the synagogue. And according to the tradition, this is the cliff that Jesus jumped off of and sort of disappeared to escape his pursuers. So it's just interesting here that, again, I can't prove that Jesus stood there and did that. But this is the traditional place outside of Nazareth where Jesus did this, performed this, according to what is written in chapter 4 of Luke's gospel. Next slide, please. How did Jesus practice Judaism? Again, it's very hard to prove exactly what Jesus actually said, what he did. I just wanted to touch on that so you know that archaeologists and historians, we don't have a lot, and biblical scholars, we don't have a lot to go on. And another thing you have to remember when we talk about Jesus and who he was and how he's portrayed in the New Testament, we also have to remember that the Judaism of 2,000 years ago was not the same as the Judaism of today. In other words, Jesus practiced the Judaism of his time, which was way before the rabbis were writing down stuff in a series of texts called the Talmud, many centuries later. And again, Jesus didn't have to worry about cell phones, computers. Obviously, I had to worry about computers tonight because my computer over there is sitting there blue screened and basically worthless right now. Jesus did not have to worry about that. Jesus had no problem with computers. So Judaism evolved over time. One of the best examples of that is the Jewish concept of bar mitzvah, which is when a Jewish boy around the age of 13 kind of performs this ritual, goes up before the synagogue congregation, typically recites a few things, and essentially becomes an adult in the eyes of the Jewish community. There's also bat mitzvah, where a girl does the same thing. And that is a relatively modern Jewish concept. Jesus would not have had a bar mitzvah. He wouldn't have known what a bar mitzvah is. That really is maybe a few hundred years old. It is not an ancient part of Judaism, as are some Jewish symbols, some Jewish practices. They are much more modern. So we also have to remember, in addition to that, that the Judaism of Jesus' time was very diverse, as it still sort of is today. But back in Jesus' time, for example, some Jews believed in literal resurrection of the body, as many Jews do today. Some Jews believed in an afterlife. But in Jesus' time, there were groups of Jews that did not believe that. They did not believe in an afterlife. They did not believe that, a Messiah was coming after they died. They did not believe that they were going to be resurrected someday, as many Jews still believe to this day. It's one of the reasons why Jews to this day, many Jews will not do autopsies unless absolutely necessary, or tattoos, or be cremated. because for at least especially observant Jews today, they believe in literal resurrection of the body. You can't mess with the body, or at least as little as possible. So we have to remember that Jesus was practicing a Judaism of his time. Yes, there were Jewish holidays like Passover and, you know, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the Jewish New Year, the Day of Atonement. That was stuff that was around in Jesus' time. But a lot of, at least some of the modern Jewish stuff was not around at Jesus' time. So we have to remember Jesus was a product of his time. Next slide, please. Let's move on. I'm going to wrap this up because we lost like 10 minutes to my computer. Keep going. I want to show you a couple more pictures. So to sort of begin to review, that's actually a great slide. Let's stop right there. That's a good one right there. To give you an idea, going back to archaeology, because I promised more pictures tonight, this is actually in the old city of Jerusalem. This is actually it sort of goes from the Muslim quarter through the Christian quarter in the old city, old narrow streets of Jerusalem. This is the traditional Via Dolorosa, the way of sorrow, where according to tradition, and this is just one little tiny snippet of that road, according to tradition, this is the path that Jesus took on his way to be crucified on the cross. Now, as far as archaeology goes related to this road, most archaeologists in this case were pretty sure this is not the actual road that Jesus would have walked down. In fact, the Via Dolorosa, this particular road, actually dates from the Middle Ages. It is not as ancient as Jesus, probably like 1,000 years later. So this is an instance of something that is part of Christian tradition. But archaeologically speaking, no, it probably was not the actual road that Jesus went down, because at least part of this road, or most of this road, probably did not exist this way. If you look at the Gospels descriptions of Pontius Pilate and stuff and where the people would have been, it doesn't seem to add up that this would have been the road. So this is an instance, archaeologically speaking, where we're pretty sure that this is not the actual route that Jesus took, but it doesn't mean it's not important. This is tradition. This is still a way of remembering the path that Jesus took. So I'm not always all caught up on truth, whether this has to be true. That is not the point. In the ancient world, as I think I taught last fall, you didn't write stuff, you didn't record stuff the way it actually was. You recorded, wrote, and adhered to tradition the way you wanted it to be. So again, we can't read the 21st century into the Middle Ages or even back into Jesus' time, because they looked at history differently. They didn't have to prove everything was true. This is the traditional way of sorrow that Jesus walked. It's good enough for me. Next slide, please. This is also at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, generally considered to be the holiest site on earth for Christians, because this is around the area where, according to tradition, Jesus was crucified and his body was laid out. And this is the famous stone of unction, where possibly Jesus' body was laid out. Do we know for sure? I mean, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in various forms goes back a long, 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 long time. So
I think we lost him again. I apologize. Yes, we lost him again. Thinking here. Technically, he has probably about 5 more minutes left in this presentation. I am not sure if he's going to pop back on. Let me see what he does. Give me a couple minutes, folks. I really apologize for these issues. This is technology that we can't predict or control. Let me see if he decides to pop back on, but I think we may. I think he probably has a few more slides left in him, but let me see if he sends me an email.
If he's unable to come back on, if you provide an email for questions, that
That's a
might
good
be
idea.
helpful. Yeah.
Yep, that's a good idea. I can definitely do that. Can put that in the chat. Let's see here. I'm going to put his email here in the chat. I'm give him a few minutes and then I will call it a day. As I said, I am not sure if he's going to be back this time because we're approaching about 10 till 7. We're supposed to go till 7, so give him a couple more minutes, folks, and then we will call it a day unless he tells me otherwise. Once again, I apologize for the inconvenience and for the technological issues. Okay, folks, I really appreciate your patience. Let me just see if he got back to me here. Really do appreciate the patience, folks. I see that most of you are still on here, so I really appreciate it. I just sent him a last email. A suggestion was made to see if he can join via phone, which I didn't think of, because then I can just advance the slides and he can talk. But let me see if he gets back to me. Oh, somebody came back. It is him. So
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
I got booted out mid-sentence and it would not let me back in. I
All
don't
right.
just I think it's the cold weather.
Maybe it is. Okay, you can continue. We got about, say, 10 minutes, and let's see what you
Okay,
can get done.
move on to the next slide. Let's keep going. I want to show at least one more picture. Then I want to do some question and answer. We could skip this. Okay. This is one of the last pictures I wanted to show. To give you an idea of how we're just not sure exactly where things are, where Jesus was. This is part of the archaeological excavation at a city called Capernaum, which is basically, if you read the Gospels, it's kind of Jesus' home base and also Peter's home. The Gospels even say, hey, Jesus went to Peter's house. So traditionally, what you're looking at is a church that was built above traditionally a first century house. That tradition says is Peter and possibly Jesus' home base. Do we know for sure? No, we have no way of knowing that for sure. We can speculate. So this is just another great archaeological site, another great illustration of, we know this is the city of Capernaum. That I think archaeologists are pretty certain on. Some cities are controversial. We're not sure we found them. Capernaum is one of those we're pretty sure we actually found the city as named in the Gospels. It's Jerusalem and Capernaum are the two most mentioned cities in the New Testament. And then, of course, Bethsaida is the third, where I dug for years. And even that's now controversial. But Capernaum, we're pretty sure this is where Jesus was. But can we say exactly this is Jesus' house or Peter's home that Jesus went to visit? It's tradition. I can't say for sure it is. I can't say for sure it's not. I have no way of knowing that. Dean Clement, are there any more slides? Is that it? I can't remember if I added one after this or not. Okay, so I just have a little explanation of this. So there's now debate in Capernaum regarding whose house this is, if it's anybody's house. Capernaum was definitely Jesus' home, as the Gospel of Mark tells us. We think that's the case, but we're just not sure. So the last couple bullet points, and then I want to take a few questions. I apologize for this technological mess up tonight. Archaeology can often confirm life events. Yes, we know certain historical events have been confirmed by archaeology that pertain to the Bible. Yes, we know that's true. But can I tell you exactly where Jesus stepped? Not necessarily. I did have a picture that we don't have time to show. I think we passed it up on a slide where we think, going from Bethsaida, this may be an actual road where Jesus walked on. It was just pretty much re-uncovered again about a decade ago, but I can't be sure of it. Archaeology is really more helpful confirming wars, events, buildings collapse, stuff like that, which there tends to be more historical documentation. But we really can't always be sure that, this is where Jesus walked, or this was Peter's house, or, this was somewhere else important. And at the last bullet point, at Bethsaida, where I dug, which is now controversial itself, there is now another archaeological site in northern Israel that claims they are the real Bethsaida. But at our Bethsaida, I guess, we even joked that we found Luke's house, because Luke, according to tradition, was a physician, and we found a first century house with medical tools in it. So we used to joke around, that must be Luke the physician's house. Are we sure of that? No. Is it a nice tradition to start? Yeah. Is it good for business? Yeah. But can I say for sure? Again, much of archaeology remains in the realm of speculation. On that note, I'm happy to answer any questions anybody has beyond why did my computer keep crashing and why couldn't Guy get in here? Beyond that, I don't know. I'm blaming the cold weather.
All right, folks. So, as I say, apologies for the technological difficulties. We got about 5 minutes. Any questions that anybody wants to ask?
Unfortunately, we can't do a redo. There's no redos in this. I can't go back. It was a very disjointed. I apologize on behalf of myself and my technology. I sincerely apologize. It's just one of those things where my computer has decided to keep crashing. Thank goodness I had a laptop nearby. But any questions I can answer about this? If not, I know it's already about 7 o'clock. I think I'm doing another one later this spring.
Yes, you have another one. I can't really remember the date.
I don't remember the date. I don't remember the topic actually, but we'll figure it out.
We'll
But
figure
again,
it out.
thank you. I see there's 50 some people still on. I appreciate it.
Yes.
Archaeology, history, and the Bible. Sometimes they're converging lines of evidence. Sometimes everything lines up real neatly and nicely. Most of the time, it doesn't. As someone who studied as a biblical scholar, who's also a historian, who did archaeology in Israel for several seasons, I can tell you it's very rare when everything comes together and we can clearly say, yeah, that's exactly what happened. We're standing somewhere where Jesus stood. But can archaeology help us piece together the New Testament, help us confirm events that took place, historical figures like Jesus or King Herod or Pontius Pilate? Yes, it's very helpful. Archaeology is helpful and the Bible is helpful, but we can't always get all the confirmation of truth. Does that worry me? No, it doesn't worry me because I'm not all hung up on everything having to be true. Because as I said, in the ancient world, that's not how they looked at history. That's not how they looked at events. They wrote history the way they wanted it to be, not as it necessarily exactly was. And that is much different than going on the internet and saying, okay, in what year did this happen? They weren't obsessed with that. There's a reason why, for example, I always tell my students, there's a reason why we know very little about Jesus' childhood. I mean, if I would ask many of you to write an autobiography of yourself, like the Gospels are sort of biographies of Jesus. If I asked you to write an autobiography, you'd be telling me when I was 3, I did this, and in high school, I did that. I was in the choir. I was a tenor in the choir. I played, tight end on the football team. Why don't we have any of that? In the 4 biographies of Jesus, we don't know any of that stuff. Why not? Answer, it simply wasn't important. They didn't care about the facts. They wanted you to know the important things that Jesus did, the things that were important to the evolution of Christianity. And that trumped any of that other stuff. So again, I'm not obsessed with the truth when it comes to doing archaeology and even proving everything in the Bible's true. I don't necessarily know if that was actually the point of everything. So on that note, thank you, Dean Clement. I appreciate it. And thank you for being patient. And we muddled through it. And I hope we still were able to put together at least a salvageable presentation.
I think we did. I think we did. Just one question I'm going to ask you here before we go.
Okay.
What do you think propelled Jesus to be so popular the way he is in modern times? Just a
Great question.
quick
Yeah, I
answer.
did say at the beginning of the lecture, before the 1 or 2 or 5 crashes, Jesus was not an international superstar. In fact, Jesus, by his own admission in the Gospels, condemns his own cities for not listening to him. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! He's even saying that my fellow Jews in Galilee, they're not even listening to me. So that's evidence from Jesus himself, apparently, that he was not listened to. What propelled him? The growth of Christianity, the more stories that circulated. Christianity, we have to remember, for 300 years or so, Christianity was an illegal religion. It was outlawed in Rome. You couldn't build a church down the street. until the Emperor Constantine said you could about 300 years after Jesus walked the earth. Once that happened, and these stories about Jesus, the miracles, the Son of God, the Trinity, the exorcisms, the great teachings, the Sermon on the Mount, by then all that stuff had sort of gelled. And Christianity was becoming amazingly popular. Simply put, why did Jesus become so popular? People obviously loved the stories told about him. They believed them. They were impressed. It was convincing, and Christianity became an extremely popular religion. In fact, the most practiced religion likely in the world today.
All righty. I see one final question, and this is definitely it. Why did the Roman Empire ban Catholicism?
Rome was a pagan empire. And especially in Jesus' time, and for many years, many decades afterwards, you were required to worship the Roman emperor and worship the Roman gods. Okay, first of all, that's major problem number one. Rome had a major problem with Christianity for a couple of reasons. Number one, Christians only believed in one God, and you won't worship our emperors. In fact, we know that the early Romans accused the Christians of being atheists. Why? Because you don't worship our gods. We don't care that you worship the Christian God. That means nothing to us. And second of all, for Rome, many Romans, Christianity made no sense. It made no sense. You worship a guy named Jesus, and we have graffiti that actually proves this. You worship a guy named Jesus in Rome's eyes, whom we executed like decades ago. We killed this guy. We executed him. And this is your hero? You worship a dead criminal. Rome did not understand Christianity. They viewed it as superstition. They viewed it as mystical in a way. Think of the idea of baptism and the Eucharist. This is my body, this is my blood, eating bread, drinking wine. The Romans said, oh my God, you're cannibals. You're like eating the body of Jesus and trying to drink his blood. You're like vampires. Rome simply did not understand Christianity. It made no sense to practice it, even though secretly some Romans surely did, but you couldn't publicize it. Rome was pagan. You follow the Roman gods, you worship the Roman emperor. There was no separation of church and state, no separation of religion and state. The emperor was the state, he was the religion. If you don't come out and play with our gods and worship our emperor, we don't like you.
Wow, really nice
Very
explanation.
Yeah, they executed Christians.
Wow.
We don't understand it. They viewed them as a rogue bunch of Jews, like initially these Jews that were just kind of causing trouble. And they just viewed it as more of a superstition from there on.
Okay, well, we appreciate the opportunity to visit you this evening, Dr. Gale. If you have any additional questions for Dr. Gale, please feel free to email him. I just dropped the email in the Q&A. It's agale2@wvu.edu. An archived version of this webinar will be available later on the Honors College website. Thank you for spending time with us. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you again, Dr. Gale, and apologies.
Thank you. I apologize.
No, it's good. It's good. It's good. We look forward to seeing you in either February or March.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Yep. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. Bye, Savannah.
See ya.